Good morning, colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for the presentation of this project, this WRC project. I am particularly excited about it because it is, firstly, a subject very close to my heart, and secondly, also my first WRC project as project lead. So let me take you through what we have done thus far. We are already actually halfway through the project. It is a 4-year project. It began right at the end of 2024. And so I'll bring you up to speed with what we have been busy with. And also so that whenever we speak about the commercialization project in the combined meetings, you have a sense of what we are talking about and what we are dealing with. So I'll run through just an overview of what I will present. I really just took also from the recent reference group meeting that we had, and really just there's a lot of overlap. So I'll share more, of what has been done thus far. We'll go through the background, the context in which the study is embedded, the aims, the study area, the methods that we are using aligned to the aims, what we have done thus far, and then I'll take you through 2 of the submitted deliverables, which are a bit more substantive, and then a look at where we are going, what we want to do, as well as what has been achieved for capacity building, which is a core aspect of also these WRC projects, and that speaks a little bit to our student ONCE's work. So I actually didn't go through the title. Yes, it's there, you read it, we can all read, but the project is assessing the commercialization potential of the former Transkei's land and water resources. And this has been done through an integrated water-land agricultural nexus. And we are focusing specifically on the OR Tambo District Municipality. And that is important to keep at the back of our minds. So general background, the Eastern Cape is a major contributor to South Africa's agricultural economy. It contributes proportions of wool, citrus, milk. These are some of its important produce. And the OR Tambo District, which is within the Eastern Cape province, literature tells us has untapped water resources and hectares of arable land. However, it has not met its full commercialization potential. So much of the production, agricultural production within the Eastern Cape, is coming from outside the area delineated as the former Transkei area. So one of the core questions that we asked in the writing of this proposal was, why is that? Why is commercialization lagging in this specific area? So that's one of the things we wanted to sort of unpack. Further background to the actual former Transkei area. It serves as an example of a former homeland area under the apartheid administration. And these were areas where Black people were relegated to, and they are characterized as predominantly rural, occupied. The population is predominantly Black people. It's also characterized by communal land tenure system, and this is a very important aspect for this study. So that means that the state owns the land, but it is administered through the traditional authorities within the area. So there's no private ownership of land, but the chiefs administer and look over the land that is managed in. So you have pockets of arable land, and I say pockets, this is relative in the South African context to the spread of commercial land. So if you look at commercial versus smallholder agriculture in South Africa, these homeland areas cover a fairly smaller proportion of land than the commercial areas do. The former Transkei was incorporated into the Eastern Cape, so it was operating as a nominally, independent, parliament and government of its own, but it was incorporated into the Eastern Cape in 1994 under under that administration. The OR Tambo District, which is where we are focusing our efforts in the study, covers 80% of this area that used to be the former Transkei. So I said earlier that the commercialization of agriculture is lagging in this area. And when we were doing initial literature review into why is that, some of the reasons include a lack of integrated planning, and this integration is across the different sectors that are related to agriculture. So water is included, land is included in the agriculture sector itself. There is human capital investment, but it is limited. There's poor investment in value chain exploration. This is another key focus of the study, as well as market access. So that we're going to expand on a little bit later. And another reason is also piecemeal policies, strategy frameworks, they fail to meet their intended outcomes, and that is not anything out, or it's not a news story. We're quite familiar with this story in the South African context. Now, I remember yesterday at our German colleague, Nina's presentation at Environmental Science. Many of us were there. I remember in the discussions and the conversation, we spoke about how very important it is for us to establish a common frame of reference for the terminology that we are using when we are implementing, a transdisciplinary project. And that's because there are many actors involved. We all have different understandings, different values. We need to be able to be speaking the same language when we refer to terminology and what we are doing. So for the purpose of this study, we keep saying commercialization. And so it's important that we also distinguish what are we referring to, or what is our understanding conceptually of commercialization. So we frame it as a multi-dimensional concept. And we say that it is involving multiple variables and the interaction within and between those variables. So we're looking at the biophysical, you're looking at economic, social, infrastructural, and governance, and how they interact with one another. And we're also not just looking at agriculture at one point, or commercialization as it's at the farm level and it's just production, but we're looking across the agricultural value chain. And all of these factors that interplay with one another across the value chain. So that's how we are understanding or we are conceptualizing commercialization. And then there are two key contexts. I remember again in yesterday's presentation we spoke about with transdisciplinary research how context is very integral to implementing a transdisciplinary study, and understanding of the context in which your research is embedded. And for this particular study, we have two lenses through which we are viewing this, or we are approaching commercialization of agriculture. And the first is value chain analysis. So here all we are saying is we are looking at commercialization across the entire agricultural value chain. So this is starting from inputs to production to processing, which includes value addition, distribution, access to markets, everything. It is a holistic approach to what it takes in order to commercialize. And we also acknowledge that the skills gaps, it's a key constraint for farmers in areas such as these to be able to commercialize. And again, when we speak of skills gaps, we are looking at these across the agricultural value chain. And this is a bit of more of the focus of Onke's study. Another lens, which is very important for our study, is an acknowledgement of the significance of the political economy. So we are looking at agricultural commercialization, and we're looking at it through the nexus of land, water, and agriculture. And it is necessary to appreciate that there is a lot of complexity in the decision making at various levels across all of these sectors. And so it's all well and good to say you want to commercialize the farmers, but that does not happen in a vacuum. That does not happen outside of politics. And then I mentioned earlier that the communal land tenure is very significant. So its implications for smallholder farmers, if they are not owning the land, it is not just a clear, straight path to what they can and cannot do in terms of commercialization if they don't own it. So the role of the traditional authorities becomes very key. And then we look at the intersection of public policies across all the sectors that are involved in agriculture. And participation of various actors in the agroeconomy. So you're not just trying to achieve this looking at the farmers in isolation, but also all the actors that are related to them. So this is kind of like the framework through which we are basing our study. A look at the aims, what we hope to achieve or what we are proposing. First of all, we want to come up with a review of the sectoral policies and frameworks to identify the gaps in commercialization support. So really just what exists, what are the challenges there, and also to then from there develop an integrated plan introducing parallel support pillars, so thinking about things like finance, thinking about things like education, and how these can support commercialization in addition to the existing sectors that we're focusing in on the study. Secondly, we want to develop an integrated mapping of the potential areas for commercialization and develop a multidimensional matrix for the areas with the greatest potential. So we're looking at the OR Tambo District, but then we need to be able to explicitly say, when we say there's great potential, how are we quantifying that? How can we visually see that? Where is the potential and what do we mean by potential? So that's aim number 2. Number 3, I spoke about the skills gaps. So we're looking at the skills demand in support of commercialization, as well as potential local and international markets. And this is using the value chain analysis or value chain based approach, looking at skills pathways that can enable farmers in communal areas to commercialize agriculture. And then lastly, we want to develop a guideline for land and water use in support of commercialization, because the title says that we are looking at the area's land and water resources in support of agriculture. Thank you, Margaret. So that is those are the aims. So an overall look at the area. So this is just a general map of the Eastern Cape divided into its district municipalities. And our focus is the OR Tambo District, which is indicated in this map by the green area. And a few, facts about the district itself. So it's east of the province on the Indian Ocean coastline. This is its total land area, population density, and the population itself, though it's a bit backdated, was 2016. And agriculture is the 4th main economic sector. It contributes about 3.5% to the Eastern Cape economy. So this is just some background of the OR Tambo District and why we selected it. Earlier I said 80% of the former Transkei area is the OR Tambo District. So we are narrowing our focus over there. A look at the methods and the methods used, and we're aligning the methods to each one of the aims of the project. So with the first one, the review of policies, that's a desktop study. So we're looking at that, and then we also wanted to show, so we're saying identifying the gaps in commercialization. Parallel support structures, we are using causal loop diagrams as a tool in order to display the connectedness between the sectors and possibly introduce what some of these support pillars can be. For the second one, which is the mapping component that I spoke about, we want to do a multi-criteria suitability analysis. So using ArcGIS Pro, that's a mapping exercise. Okay, I'll speak to this a bit later. For the one with the skills demand, and we want to develop a matrix which shows what skills are needed across the agricultural value chain for commercialization. This is now the participatory aspect or the method that we'll use, workshops, focus group discussions. And lastly, for the guideline for land and water use, this one we want to use a multi-criteria value chain approach. We want to create sort of a step-by-step guide. This is what can be or should be done, supported by the value chain analysis, sort of scholarly backing. So a summary of the deliverables for the project overall, we have 10 deliverables that are expected of us by the funder. So there's just a summary of what needs to be done, including the capacity building is with reference to Onke, who is our student on the project. And then this is where we are. I said we are exactly halfway through. So we've done, worked through 5. We have 5 more to go, and I'm just going to take you through what has been done so far. So deliverable 3 was a review of the sectoral policies. This was directly aligned to the first aim of the project. We submitted this last year in August, and this was a document analysis. This is a summary. It was a very lengthy document, but it had 6 chapters, and this was a summary of what was included in that overview. So I'm just speed through kind of what was within each of those chapters. We first kind of just looked at the social economic context of the OR Tambo District in terms of agriculture. And then we looked at challenges of smallholder farmers in the district. This was nothing new, no different to the challenges of smallholder farmers in communal areas in South Africa. So struggles with resources, financial exclusion, access to markets, mechanization, transportation, the list is endless. But if you do any literature review on smallholder farmers in South Africa, this is commonly what is found. And then chapter 3 was giving a rationale for why we wanted to do a policy review, why it was important, because we're saying there are more than one sector that is focusing on this issue. And what we found, one of the key takeaways, was that they're all speaking the same language. The mandate is the same. There are gross inequalities. There is a need for transformation. There is a need to commercialize smallholder farmers. And there's different terminology used. They'll say things like transition them from small scale or smallholder to semi-commercial, for example, but just getting them out of that and leveling the playing field. However, there is a lack of integration in these frameworks. So they're speaking the same language, the goal is the same, but they are working in silos. And then chapter 4 looks at the significance of the study. It looks into why we are proposing that using water as an entry point is important, being a water institute. So we're saying that, from a biophysical point of view, water is key. What is the water that is available from what is known? How much of that water has been allocated to the reserve and then for agricultural use? Within what is allocated for agricultural use, where is that distributed? And what is the access that these farmers have to that? How easy is it for them to be able to get access to that water? So this was just some of the contents of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 now, we really fleshed out that value chain analysis, theoretical framework, as well as the political economy, backing that up with literature. And then lastly, we just did a sort of comparative analysis with other developing countries that have achieved some success in commercializing their smallholder farmers. Am I almost out of time, right?
You got 5 minutes, but I'm going to give you 10.
Thank you so much. So deliverable 4 now, this was illustrating, we presented these as causal link diagrams. And this was illustrating the interaction between, the various social, economic, and political dimensions involved within the agricultural sector. We submitted that this year in March. And the purpose of these was to be able to give a physical representation of how interconnected everything is, and the need to use an integrated approach in any kind of solutions or proposed solutions to the problem. So we developed 4 of these causal loop diagrams. I'm really just going to give a presentation of one, or so that you have a idea of what it looked like. The first one looked at agricultural commercialization. The second looked at agriculture, essentially breaking down the nexus. So one was agriculture, one was water, one was land, and then the first one kind of just looked at them all holistically integrated. And we wanted this to be a visual tool. I said we have various actors in this project. It's not just us academics. And so in the name of finding creative ways of communicating the problem so that we can arrive at at solutions, this was just one approach that we thought was valuable in using. The slide just sort of summarizes how the CLDs were developed, or the process that was used. So we started from the findings in the desktop study, in that sectoral review, picking up what are some of the key variables that were coming up, identifying them, and then clustering them. And then from there now we mapped the causal relationships between those variables. So how do they relate to one another? Is it as a positive relation or negative relation? And then how, do these relationships either reinforce one another, or do they balance each other? So just a bit of a summary of causal loop diagram development. I could expand on it for much longer, but in the interest of time, this is just to give a snapshot of the process behind. And then a visual of one of them, the first one, which was sort of like the meta CLD, which incorporated land resources, water resources, and then these were the sort of core variables. And then we looked at interactions across all of these variables, and this is what it looked like. And it looks very complex. I'm sure just from one glance, it looks very complicated. But when you begin to sort of unpack and say, okay, what is the nature of these relationships and how are they reinforcing one another, it becomes a useful starting point for conversation when you're at a table with diverse stakeholders, to be able to actually illustrate and say, when we say it is highly complex, when we're talking about the political economy, this is what we mean. So that was the use of CLDs. And where we're sitting at now for this year, we have 2 other substantive deliverables that we want to submit. The one that we are currently working on now is the mapping. And I say this one is also a very crucial one, and one in which our stakeholders are particularly interested in, because they're saying, show us, when you say there is potential, I want to see where, if I am coming in as an agri-investor, where should I put my money and why? So we're working on a multi-criteria suitability analysis, and we're still sort of working our way through the conceptual behind this, in terms of there are multiple ways you could approach it. One, you could pick a selection of crops. You could group them together and say, okay, here's a list of potential crops that could be farmed. We have decided as a project team that we are focusing on crops agriculture. There is also livestock farming that is taking place in the area, but we're just, in terms of the scope of the study, we're looking at crops. So we could pick a selection of crops. We could look at cereals, vegetables, fruits, legumes, and then say these are the biophysical characteristics that are required for the growth of a selection of these specific crops. And if we're applying the value chain analysis lens, you need to then justify why did you select those crops. So how significant would these crops be for commercialization? You'd look at maybe trends, current and projected trends in agriculture in the country in terms of food security, what crops are being grown, in terms of exports. You might want to include a selection of high value crops that have great potential. So for something like, say, kiwis or macadamias or blueberries, and this is some things that are surfacing in the literature review, that there are pockets of land in the area which have ideal biophysical variables for the growth of certain high value crops such as those. And what would the implications of those be, if a farmer jumped onto that and said, oh, I did not know that the land I'm currently sitting on has great potential for the growth of this crop. Or another way could be to just select a scale of analysis. So maybe let's say catchment scale. So you look at the quaternary catchments that are represented within the area and you say what are biophysical characteristics there. Look at the climate features, look at the temperature, look at the land cover, look at the vegetation, the soils, the quality of the soils, and all other biophysical characteristics that are important for agricultural growth. And then we present that in the map. So someone would look and say, okay, if these are the biophysical features, what crops can I then grow there, and what would the value of those crops be for me as a small-scale farmer or as another actor in the agricultural value chain for commercialization. And then lastly, the one that I said has more, participatory approaches that we want to use. This would require us to go back again and engage with the actors at the table. We are planning a workshop in the month of August that would like to bring our farmers as well as some of the other actors that we have, engaged with thus far in the project, in order to now work on the skills demand analysis. We want to develop a matrix to say across the agricultural value chain, these are all the components, and then these are the skills that are needed or that are matched to the specific point in the value chain. And we want to co-create that or develop that with all the actors on the table to say, in your opinion, not just on based on what we are saying, but in your opinion, what are the skills needed in order to meet these demands for commercialization. Onke's project, I said I want to touch on that briefly. I borrowed this from him with his permission. When I say, we're looking at skills across the agricultural value chain. So this is just like a visual of, the different points in the value chain and the skills needed for each one of those. So there's a unique set of skills for each. So in harvesting, you need skills such as those. In process packaging, you need skills such as those. And then there are some that cut across all of these, like bookkeeping, finance, and credit. So he's looking at what are some of the constraints to acquiring these skills, as well as some of the pathways or opportunities for acquisition of these skills across the agricultural value chain. I want to end off with some reflections on the experience and the implementation thus far, where we are. What is abundantly clear is that this is an excellent example of a transdisciplinary research project. Because with transdisciplinary research, you have multiple disciplines, but you also have multiple stakeholders, including non-academic stakeholders, community members, policy makers, the list goes on and on, but you're all working together to address real world problems. And right from that at a project team level, because we have a mixture of project team members, which also includes members who are non-academic actors, and then from the stakeholders that we have engaged with and we are collaborating with as well, there's representation from different areas. You have representations from the traditional authorities, you have representations from people like the rural development agencies, you have the government department of agriculture, water and sanitation, land reform, which is a very contentious issue in South Africa, but also very significant in the communal context. You have all these actors coming together, and then you have the agri-investors themselves. And what is clear is that everyone has different values, so their vested interest in the project is based on their personal values. And managing that diversity, bringing everyone to arrive at a place of a common language is tremendously difficult. Tremendously difficult. It requires a great deal of patience, humility, appreciating that there is no knowledge that is rubbish or inferior to the other, but all of us, what we have to say is important. I'll give an example there on the side. When we were out in the field earlier this month, we traveled with representatives from one of the traditional councils, the Transkei Traditional Council, which forms only one of the local municipalities within the district. And they have a big investment in the project because they have a development arm within their traditional council, which is particularly focused on wanting to commercialize their small farms. And it's something that's just started. It's kind of like a legacy project that they're very proud of. And they say, look, in our local municipality area or the jurisdiction that our traditional council covers, we have land readily available for agricultural development. We have water and a license that has been got for water. We just need to speak to the right people to get us to where we want to get in terms of agricultural development. But they're speaking a very different language from what the Department of Agriculture, and at our reference group meeting, the representative from the Department of Agriculture was an agricultural economist and presented a very different and a very bleak picture of the realities on the ground. So getting everybody to sort of come to the table and participate in the project, but also navigating that complexity of everybody's coming in with a different interest or a different value, and then defining and working within the project scope. So arriving at a place of saying, this project is huge, the time and resource money allocation for it, we cannot promise more than what, we cannot give or deliver more than what we've promised in the project proposal. However, there is so much opportunity for so much more. We're just scratching on the surface. And so defining the scope that we will work in, arriving at saying we want to focus in the OR Tambo District. Within the OR Tambo District, which is also very large, where are we also focusing our efforts? Narrowing that down to something that is realistic and manageable for the time frame that we have to work in has also been a bit of a challenge. And we have also realized that there's great opportunity for future work and expansion of this. If we're only focusing on one aspect of the district, we could expand it further. So we're hoping that we will also make use of that opportunity in future. That's about it, folks. I'll be happy for us to engage and hear some of your comments, questions, insights. What do you think? What could we do better? What have we left out? But this brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you.